The Aeneid is one of the greatest and most influential works in the history of literacy. Because it was written over 2,000 years ago in a now dead language, it's built on foundations of ancient history, politics, mythology, and literature, which would have been well known to its original audience, but which aren't so well known to the average reader today. To get much out of the Aeneid, then, most 21st century readers will need to acquire some ancient background knowledge first. How much? Well, the sky's the limit. There are university professors who spend their entire careers studying to understand the Aeneid and still don't claim to know everything about it. But the purpose of this short video is to help first-time readers build a basic minimum of the background knowledge they'll need to read the Aeneid with a reasonable level of understanding and appreciation. I'll divide this information up into three areas: the historical background, the mythological background, and the literary background. First, the history. The Aeneid was written by a man named Publius Vergilius Maro. In English, we call him Virgil. Virgil was a Roman. He lived in Italy just over 2,000 years ago in the 1st century BC. During his lifetime, Rome's republican system of government was destroyed by a series of bloody civil wars, and the last military leader left standing became Rome's first emperor. This was Augustus Caesar, the adopted son of Julius Caesar. Augustus reigned over Rome's Mediterranean Empire for over 40 years, largely in peace, and has gone down as one of history's most able and influential rulers. One of his many projects was the sponsorship of literature. He chose several Roman writers to become official state poets and paid them a salary to write. Much of the poetry produced by these writers, the so-called Augustan poets, was of very high quality and is still widely read today. The most famous of these poets were Ovid, Horace, and Virgil. After writing some works of pastoral poetry in his earlier career, Virgil began a new project at Augustus's request. The emperor intended to give Rome one outstandingly brilliant work of literature, head and shoulders above all the rest, a national foundation myth that would portray the Roman character and the Roman achievement to the rest of the world, both in his own time and for all time to come. He succeeded. Virgil spent the last 10 years of his life working on the epic poem that would become the Aeneid. He was a perfectionist and worked at an agonizingly slow pace, composing only 30 or 40 lines a day, and then destroying all but the 2 or 3 very best of these every night. He died before he felt the Aeneid was properly finished, and left orders in his will that the manuscripts be burned and never read. Augustus, finding that the book was substantially complete and a work of undeniable excellence, willfully disobeyed Virgil's dying wish and had it published. It became an instant classic. What is the Aeneid about? The central character of the Aeneid is Aeneas, a Trojan warrior from stories of Greek and Roman myth, whose mother was Venus, the goddess of love. Here our historical and mythological backgrounds overlap. The wealthy old Roman family of the Julii, which the Emperor Augustus officially joined when he was adopted by Julius Caesar, claims to be descended from Venus through Aeneas. Augustus didn't take any active part in writing the Aeneid, but since the basic project was his idea, and since he was paying Virgil's salary, it's no surprise that the content of the Aeneid is in many ways supportive not only of the Roman state, but of Augustus himself and of his prospective dynasty. Roman society placed extraordinary emphasis on ancestral pedigree, and the glorification of Aeneas, Augustus's supposed ancestor, was a powerful affirmation of Augustus himself. Virgil went further, too, actually making explicit reference to Augustus more than once throughout the Aeneid, intimating that the emperor and his descendants were the divinely sanctioned rulers of Rome and the world, whose advent had been prophesied centuries before. At least this is what strikes me as the most plausible interpretation of Virgil's portrayal of Augustus. Other scholars argue that Virgil is actually hostile to Augustus and implicitly attacks him throughout the Aeneid. It's clear that the Aeneid is far too sophisticated and nuanced to be considered simple propaganda, but the claim that its political dimension is on balance anti-Augustan seems implausible. Of course, scholars can find a way to disagree over just about anything, so you should do your own reading and make up your own mind. Let's move to the mythological background itself. Aeneas's mythological context is in stories of the Trojan War. The Trojan War is not well documented historically and may never have happened at all, but its myths place it in the Bronze Age, around 1200 BC. Even for the ancient Romans of Virgil's day, this is ancient history. Traditional tales of events over 1,000 years past. The most well-known versions of these stories were contained in the most famous books of antiquity, the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer, which were written down around 700 BC. We'll have more to say about Homer when discussing the Aeneid's literary background in a bit. The Trojan War was said to have been instigated when Paris, a prince of the powerful kingdom of Troy, either kidnapped or seduced Helen, who was the most beautiful woman in the world and the wife of Menelaus, king of Mycenae. Geography is important, so let's look at a map. Both these kingdoms were located on the shores of the Aegean Sea. Troy was on the northwestern coast of modern Turkey. Mycenae was in the upper Peloponnese of modern Greece. After Paris sailed back to Troy with Helen, Menelaus discovered what had happened, got very upset, and declared war on Troy. He journeyed throughout ancient Greece, at that time a geopolitical jigsaw puzzle of independent cities and small kingdoms, explaining his grievance, building alliances, and rounding up ships and soldiers, and then sailed northeast across the Aegean to attack Troy with this enormous army. The city of Troy, however, was an impenetrable fortress, and the Greek and Trojan armies fought on the plain in front of Troy for 10 years, the Greeks unable to capture the city, and the Trojans unable to drive the Greeks back into the sea. This fighting is the subject of Homer's Iliad. Aeneas appears in the Iliad at several points, fighting valiantly against the greatest Greek warriors, always escaping death with the help of some of the Olympian gods, who protected him in order to preserve the Trojan lineage once the city inevitably fell. At length, the greatest Trojan warrior, Hector, and the greatest Greek warrior, Achilles, are both killed. Still, no end to the war was in sight. Seeing that Troy could never be taken by force, the crafty Greek general Odysseus, called Ulysses by the Romans, devised a trick, what we now call the Trojan horse. He directed the Greeks to build a giant hollow wooden horse on the plain in front of the city, and then to break camp, pack up, get in their ships, and sail away, as if giving up and going back to Greece. The horse would appear to the Trojans to be an offering to the gods, given by the Greeks to assure safe sailing home. Ulysses predicted that the Trojans would likely haul it into their city and display it as a trophy of victory, rather than investigating or destroying it. He hid himself in the belly of the horse with a small group of armed men, and once the Trojans had indeed hauled the horse inside the city walls, and then mostly passed out after a long night of drinking and celebrating a victorious end to the war, Ulysses' squad slipped out of the horse and opened the city gates for the entire Greek army, which had quietly sailed back and disembarked under cover of night. Troy was doomed, but Aeneas survived. Leading a large group of refugees away from the city, he set sail with them on a series of eventful voyages in the central Mediterranean, looking for a place to resettle. These Trojan refugees had a hard time of it, mostly because Juno, the queen of the gods, hated Troy with a passion and was on a mission to wipe out its survivors. Why was she so angry? Well, Paris, the Trojan prince who had sparked the Trojan War by abducting Helen, had previously been involved in another incident which caused much of Juno's anger. We call this incident the Judgment of Paris. 3 goddesses, Juno, Venus, and Minerva, the goddess of war, were having a bitter argument over which one of them was the most beautiful. Paris, chosen as impartial arbitrator of the dispute, awarded the prize to Venus. Juno and Minerva were enraged by this snub and remained hostile to the entire Trojan people thereafter. But another reason Juno had it in for Aeneas was a prophecy, that his descendants were destined to destroy one of her favorite cities, Carthage. Here the historical and mythological backgrounds intersect again. Historically, Carthage was originally a colony founded on the tip of North Africa, modern Tunisia, by settlers who had sailed from Tyre, a city in Phoenicia, modern Lebanon. By the 3rd century BC, Rome and Carthage had both grown to become strong regional powers in the central Mediterranean, and it became clear that there wasn't enough room for the both of them. They fought a vicious series of wars over 5 generations, most famously the Second Punic War, in which the Carthaginian general Hannibal somehow climbed over the Alps with an army, including war elephants, and wiped out the entire Roman military several times over, pushing Rome to the brink of destruction. In the end, Rome defeated Carthage in the Third Punic War and flattened the city completely to ensure it could never threaten war again. Mythologically, it was said that Aeneas came to Carthage during his wanderings after the fall of Troy, and struck up a romance with Dido, the Carthaginian queen. Called away to Italy by his divine destiny to establish the ancestral foundations of the Roman people, Aeneas deserted Dido, and this betrayal was the mythical origin story of the antipathy between the arch-enemies Rome and Carthage. Although Rome eventually won permanent victory over Carthage, Dido's curse of vengeance upon Aeneas and his descendants was very nearly fulfilled in the terror and slaughter brought by Hannibal to the gates of Rome in the Second Punic War. When Aeneas and the Trojan survivors left Carthage, they sailed north, and after enduring a few more adventures, they landed in west-central Italy, the modern region of Lazio. Some of the native Italians gave them a hostile reception, but after a series of armed conflicts, the descendants of Aeneas and the Trojans settled in, founding and ruling over a city called Alba Longa. How does Rome fit into this? About 400 years after the Trojans arrived in Italy, Rhea Silvia, a princess of Alba Longa directly descended from Aeneas, became pregnant by Mars, the god of war, and gave birth to Romulus and Remus, the famous twin brothers who survived exposure being suckled by a she-wolf and went on to found the city of Rome, traditionally in the year 753 BC. One more remark on the mythology. The multitude of gods, demigods, and human characters in the Aeneid can be difficult to keep track of. If you're reading a reasonably recent translation, which you should be doing for your first reading, there's probably a glossary of names in the back, which you should refer to regularly, or at least whenever you feel yourself getting a little lost in the mix of unfamiliar names. There are often multiple names for a single place, god, or human. This kind of variation was used for poetic and literary effect, but it can make things a little harder to follow if you don't pay attention. It's useful to keep in mind that these alternate names are often derived from ancestry or origin for people, or from geographical situation for places. Patronymics are common. Aeneas is called son of Anchises, after his father, and the Trojans are called Dardans or Teucrians, after the mythical founding father figures Dardanus and Teucer. Italy is called Hesperia, meaning land in the west, or Ausonia, an old Greek name for the lower part of the peninsula. The Greeks themselves are called Achaeans, or Argives, or Danans, all for similar reasons. These are just a few examples, but if you pay attention to context, use your name glossary or Wikipedia when you get confused, you'll be just fine. Finally, let's talk about the literary background. Virgil wrote the Aeneid in classical Latin, the language of ancient Rome. The Aeneid is an epic poem. That is, a long poem about the mythical adventures of gods and heroes, composed in a format called dactylic hexameter. This means that it's written out in lines of 6 metrical feet in length, each foot containing a mixture of long and short syllables, whose placement is governed by certain rules. The poet's goal was to abide by these rules while still conveying the intended meaning and painting the desired picture in the reader or listener's mind. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once called this dancing in chains. Virgil achieved it with consummate skill. The weight, emotion, balance, and polish of his lines, combined with the judicious structure of his content and narrative, make him almost uncontroversially the greatest poet of the Latin language, and arguably the greatest in human history. To appreciate this, you need to spend several years learning Latin. But here's an example just so you can hear what it sounds like. One of the most vivid lines in the Aeneid, from Book 3, in which Aeneas describes the sudden appearance of Polyphemus, the hulking, hideous Cyclops still bleeding from his gouged and blinded eye. Monstrorend informe ingens cui lumen ademptum. The full story of Polyphemus had been told in Homer's Odyssey, and as we've already seen, the entire narrative of the Aeneid is situated in the Homeric context of the Trojan War. But Virgil's engagement with Homer goes far beyond a shared background of characters and events. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were the original epic poems of classical literature, and by writing in the same genre with the same metrical format of dactylic hexameters, Virgil was consciously engaging the Homeric literary tradition. In Virgil's day, all educated Romans knew how to read Greek, and were familiar with the Homeric epics. The Aeneid contains contrasts and comparisons and references to Homer behind every rock and tree, and so it's impossible for us to understand the Aeneid well without being familiar with the Iliad and Odyssey. The basic background on Homer is a topic sufficient to fill several other videos by itself, so we can't cover it here. I'll just note one basic example of Virgil's literary engagement with Homer. There are two Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and only one Aeneid. But Virgil incorporates Homer's narrative structure by using the first half of the Aeneid, books 1 through 6, to tell a story of seafaring adventures in search of a home after the fall of Troy, which is the basic premise of the Odyssey, and then using the second half of the Aeneid to tell a story of a bloody war instigated by the loss of a woman, which is the basic premise of the Iliad. Homer is the most significant aspect of the Aeneid's literary prehistory, but Virgil and his epic also had a long literary afterlife. Like all texts written by the classical Greeks and Romans, the Aeneid was published in the form of papyrus scrolls, which have long since rotted and disappeared, and so we have nothing remotely approaching a first edition. Books were successively copied out by hand, with older copies being thrown away or burned when they became too tattered to use anymore. Not until dried and stretched animal skin, parchment, became a popular material for bookmaking do some individual copies become durable enough to have survived to the present day. This happened around the fall of the Roman Empire, and so the oldest complete manuscripts that survive today were created in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. If any given text went long enough without anyone bothering to undertake the significant time and expense of manually transcribing a new copy of it, all its existing copies would eventually deteriorate or be lost or destroyed, and the text would be gone from the world forever. This was the fate of texts like the Palamedes of Aeschylus, or the conic sections of Euclid, or the Republic of Aristotle. And probably well over 90% of all written works from the ancient world suffered the same fate. The body of ancient literature that survives today is largely limited to the few works which happen to be consistently popular and important all the way from their publication right up through the Middle Ages and into the modern period, and as a result were preserved by constant recopying. The Aeneid was one such text. Its widely recognized quality not only kept it in circulation, but made it central to the future tradition of great epic poetry. To paint with a very broad brush, the epic tradition has traditionally been seen as having 4 great practitioners: Homer, Virgil, Dante, and Milton. We've already mentioned Homer and Virgil. Dante Alighieri, an Italian from early 14th century Florence, wrote the Divine Comedy, the most famous part of which is the Inferno. Engagement with Virgil is obvious at every step of the way. The Divine Comedy describes Dante receiving a guided tour of the 3 realms of the Christian afterlife: hell, purgatory, and paradise. Dante's guide in hell and purgatory is none other than Virgil himself, who is represented as a sage of great wisdom and restraint. His qualifications to act as a guide through the netherworld may have arisen from a new strand of his reputation that was woven in the Middle Ages, when his biography took a supernatural turn. Many tales were told of Virgil, the powerful sorcerer. John Milton, an Englishman of the 17th century, wrote Paradise Lost. Like Dante's Divine Comedy, Paradise Lost is a Christian epic, but Milton shows less overt literary engagement with Virgil than Dante had, although Milton did know the Aeneid very well. The chief parallel between Milton and Virgil as epic poets is the arc of their career. Just like Virgil, Milton composed some limited, shorter poems in his earlier career, and consciously viewed these as preparatory exercises for his life's great masterwork, which he didn't begin writing until middle age. By this time, Milton had become completely blind, and so could not write. He composed Paradise Lost in his mind, and recited the lines to his daughters, who wrote them down. In a way, Milton brought the epic tradition full circle, back to Homer, who was traditionally said to have been a blind bard who traveled ancient Greece reciting his poetry aloud. Although this is a video about Virgil, I can't let Milton pass without giving him a special recommendation. At this point, I've read Homer in Greek, Virgil in Latin, Dante in Italian, and Milton in English, and Milton is, for me, the greatest epic poet of them all. If you know English, you need to read Paradise Lost before you die. So as soon as you finish the Aeneid, you know what to read next. Virgil's continued influence was not limited to the epic tradition. In early modern Europe and its colonies, Latin literature was a constant in education at every level, and Virgil's Aeneid became a canonical text that was read in its original language by almost every educated person in the Western world. The influence Virgil has exerted on modernity is incalculable. For just one illustration of this, next time you have an American $1 bill in your hand, turn it over and look at the reverse side of the Great Seal. Both those Latin mottos, Annuit Coeptis and Novus Ordo Seclorum, are taken from Virgil's poetry. Well, we've completed a basic whirlwind tour of the historical background, the mythological background, and the literary background of Virgil's Aeneid. I hope you've learned a few things that'll help you understand and appreciate it, and I hope you'll agree that although it takes a little extra effort to grapple with an ancient text, the literary genius and historical impact of Virgil's writing make it all worthwhile.